Good evening, everyone, and welcome to an Ex Libris program from the Providence Athenaeum. I'm Robin Wetherill, the library's Director of Membership and External Relations. For nearly 200 years, the Athenaeum has been at the heart of cultural life in Providence, and our mission is to enrich the mind, inspire the spirit, and elevate the public discourse. These programs have been carefully curated to do just that. I want to welcome everyone in our live audience here and everyone joining us from home. We're deeply grateful to the members and friends who make our programs possible, including our season sponsors, the Ira S. and Anna Galkin Charitable Trust, Taz A. Miller III, Birch Coffee, and the Charles A. and Lois H. Miller Foundation, Bank of America, Residential Properties, the June Rockwell Levy Foundation, and the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. This evening's program is also sponsored by the Richard and Barbara Bell Fund for Social Justice. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce longtime Athenaeum members and friends, Rob Dimmick and Ray Rickman. They're the co-founders of Stages of Freedom, an award-winning nonprofit that has at its core addressing racial inequities in Rhode Island and ensuring that Black Lives Matter. Their mission is to build community and advance racial equity by using the arts and humanities to create and present programming that illuminates and celebrates Black Rhode Island life and culture to a large and diverse audience. To provide youth of color free swimming lessons in order to reduce the high number of drownings in the BIPOC community, dismantle systemic barriers, and ensure their health and well-being, and to elevate and empower Black youth by providing workshops and access to cultural opportunities. They're joining us tonight to discuss their new venture, the only museum in Rhode Island dedicated to illuminating the remarkable stories of Black excellence in the state. At the conclusion of the presentation, they will be joined in conversation by Morgan Graff, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society. Please join me in welcoming Rob Dimmick and Ray Rickman.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be in what I consider my home, away from home. And my partner in crime and other things, Ray Rickman. Museums are vital to our ability to interpret the past and understand our place in our future. The business of museums is to provide spaces for social interaction and reflection and make valuable contributions to our understanding of each other. Stages of Freedom's museum is the only African-American museum in Rhode Island. It is a repository of artifacts, reading material, exhibits, and stories that show the excellence of Black lives and the intersection of Black and white lives. To get to its existence requires a nearly 40-year journal that Ray Rickman and I have taken to illuminate the depth of commitment African Americans have made to Rhode Island's cultural, political, and artistic landscape. And I think the success of what Ray and I have done over these many, many years, 4 decades, is successful because we're coming at these stories from both an African American and a Caucasian perspective. You can't separate out Black and white history. They are inextricably intertwined due to essentially slavery. From our love affairs with Ciceretta Jones, the nation's first Black opera diva, to our admiration of William J. Brown, the astonishingly accomplished free man of color on College Hill, to our adoration of Edward and Christiana Bannister, Providence's Black Victorian power couple who shaped art, philanthropy, and community in ways that still resonate today in the Providence Art Club, RISD, and the Bannister Nursing Center. We were compelled to create pop-up museums across the state to tell their stories. We did this through tenacity, creativity, and coalitions with cultural partners. We provided exhibits for Lifespan, the Providence Public Library, the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. We were the only non-university entity to mount exhibits at Brown University's John Hay Library. These included displays on William J. Brown, Langston Hughes, Roger Williams, abolitionist Lydia Mariah Child, and 2 on Black gay men. Virtually all of these were drawn from our years of scholarship and our own personal collections of books and ephemera. In 2011, we produced Creative Survival, a monumental exhibit which explored Rhode Island's African-American foodways from 1690 to the present at Johnson & Wales Culinary Arts Museum. And when I speak about 1690, one of the most exciting objects in that exhibit was a cheese press from the South County Museum that was used by enslaved women on the plantations in South County to create what was at that time known as Rhode Island cheese, the most coveted cheese in the world exported to Europe. It came about after we viewed the Culinary Arts Museum's exhibit, Small State, Big Food, which explored Rhode Island cuisine, but failed to include any Black contributions. And so after going through that entire exhibit, we proposed to the director of the museum an exhibit that would do so. Our exhibit gained national attention and attracted the Culinary Museum's largest opening and longest run. As with our other projects, youth engagement was essential. And so we solicited the Black culinary arts students at Johnson & Wales to prepare a 7-course tasting at stations set up throughout the exhibit, which people were just in awe of. And our keynote for that event was Norma Jean Darden, who published what we believe is the first cookbook, Black or white, that uses food as biography. And so as you go through the cookbook, you encounter her relatives and the foods that they used and the tables that they sat at as they ate that food. And she gave the most compelling, uplifting talk, free of notes, that left all of us floating on air. And the other beauty of that event was that the dishes that the Black culinary arts students created were drawn from her cookbook. And we didn't tell her that this was happening until she arrived, and she was in tears. It was just a beautiful confluence of foodways, creativity, and community. All right, so those are the students I mentioned following the event, taking their bow. So in 2015, we opened Do Lord Remember Me, the Black church in Rhode Island. A 7-panel exhibit which toured the state and revealed the powerhouse that the church has been in generating liberty, autonomy, resistance, forgiveness, character, business, culture, and self-determination. We opened it at the First Baptist Church in America, out of which emerged the African Meeting House in 1819, the state's first Black church, with a concert, a sermon, this being delivered by Reverend Doris Hook of Congdon Street Baptist Church, the oldest Black church standing in Rhode Island. A dramatic reading, this is Joe Wilson delivering Reverend Alexander Crummel's letter to the state legislature saying that Black men should have the right to vote in 1842. And as a result of that letter and the Dorr Rebellion, Black men were given the right to vote. And a celebration of fortitude and freedom. The exhibit traveled to the Redwood Library, where you see folks taking in the exhibit here, the Museum of Work and Culture, Roger Williams University, Bristol Art Museum, and countless churches across Rhode Island, and attracted significant media attention. In 2016, we assembled an extensive exhibit on Black performing arts in Rhode Island at the Providence Public Library entitled Stages of Freedom, because the term speaks not only to the performative stages we act upon, but the aspirational reach for freedom, levels of which we are sometimes achieving but never fully. We chose the name Stages of Freedom for our nonprofit. The gala opening was followed by an autobiographical homecoming performance by Rose Weaver, a Trinity rep. A veteran of Trinity, Weaver had taken a Hollywood hiatus before returning to her acting roots here in Rhode Island. In 2018, we saw the 150th anniversary of Ciceretta Jones's birth, which we acknowledged through a national conference. Hundreds gathered from as far away as California to attend an exhibit, an unveiling of one of her concert gowns restored to its former glory and shown at the Redwood Library. This dress was restored by the same woman who restored Jackie Kennedy's wedding gown. A performance, this is Becky Bass performing in The Sun is Shining, a beautiful theatrical rendition of Ciceretta Jones's early life as a concert singer. And interestingly enough, the piece was originally created in 1976, and it was the first public performance that Viola Davis gave in public. And the only sad thing about that is Viola Davis doesn't sing, and so the voice of Ciceretta as an operatic singer was absent, but here very much present with Becky Bass, who does sing. A concert with Raymond Jackson, who you see in the center taking a bow. He grew up in the Congdon Street Baptist Church and became a classical pianist, and essentially follows in the footsteps of Ciceretta Jones, who, when she retired from her concert career and vaudevillian tour, joined the choir at Congdon Street Baptist Church. And then a lecture by author Maureen Lee, who's written the only biography of Ciceretta Jones, and archivist at the Carnegie Hall Archives, Gino Francesconi. And at the very end of this 3-day conference, a dedication of a magnificent headstone, which we fundraised and placed on her gravesite after 85 years without one. Ciceretta Jones died in abject poverty. She sold everything that she owned, including her homes, 17 medals that she was given by dignitaries throughout the world for whom she performed, her Tiffany silverware, in order to take care of her mother, who was ill, and to take in orphaned Black children. That's how she spent her money. And that's who she became at the end of her life, an extraordinary caregiver. Markers such as Jones's headstone have been part of our ongoing effort to identify and memorialize sites rich with Black history. In the process, we have created an open air museum. In contribution to that, we have erected plaques memorializing Providence's Celebrity Club, the first integrated jazz club in New England. A plaque for Ciceretta Jones near her home on Pratt Street. You'll find that at essentially the base of South Court Street. And following the successful petitioning of Providence's City Council, stripping the name McGee Street from College Hill, which had honored for 200 years a slave captain, and replacing it with Bannister Street. The name change is significant because it is the first street in Providence officially named for a Black person, unlike several others which are merely honorific. And it identifies a route both Edward and Christiana took to walk home from their day's work at their respective art studio and hair salon to their house on Benevolent Street. All of these sites and many more form the constellation of our regular Black historic walking tours. As museums go, collections are essential. And so we have assembled several online resources, databases that help the public navigate the extraordinary output of literature by and about Rhode Island African Americans. This is called Disappearing Ink, which I actually unveiled here at the Athenaeum when it was published in book form. And I quickly realized after that that it needed to be an online resource, because right after publishing it, I'd already collected another 100 entries. The entries now are well over 1,000. In the smallest state in the Union, Rhode Island has 1,000, and I guarantee you many more pieces of writing by and about African Americans. and the innumerable sites throughout which our state is rich with Black life and accomplishments. And this is called On the Road to Freedom. It's a town by town guide to African-American sites that are extant. I'm not dealing with sites that might have been there or were there at one time. I want people to be able to actually go there if they so choose and see a building, a marker, a grave site, and commune with those spaces. After 5 years in our space at 10 Westminster Street, at the confluence of the Providence River, RISD, and multiple cultural institutions, we decided that our small boutique Black museum housed within our retail and event space needed more room to tell more stories, a place to hang our hat of our 40 years work. And so during the pandemic, we reimagined the space, most of which was devoted to retail trade of donated books and collectibles to fund our award-winning swim empowerment program for Black Rhode Island youth. We wrote grants, cleared space, culled thousands of donated items, designed new exhibits, pulled archival materials, and sought media coverage. Providence Monthly, Rhode Island Monthly, and Cox Cable gave us wonderful visibility in feature pieces. Beginning this spring, we have held several soft openings, special tours for school children, and tailor-made events for community groups, corporations, and church congregations. I just want to give you an example of some of the aspects and elements of the museum. So this is essentially a model of a slave ship. And in its case, it represents the Sally that was owned and sailed by the Brown brothers. And in the framed object to your right is the manifest of what was on that ship when it first sailed to enslave Africans. This inverted chair came to us as a donation with a broken cane seat. And I was a little miffed at why someone would donate a broken chair to us until I suddenly recalled the story of the most prolific slaver in America, George DeWolf of Bristol, who on a return from enslaving Africans, found that one of the African women on the ship had smallpox. And so he had her hoisted to the top of the ship's mast, lashed there with the hopes that she would die. And after 3 days, she didn't. And so he had her brought down, tied to a chair, and heaved over the side of the ship to her death. He was told on by one of his shipmates on the return to Rhode Island, brought to trial, and at the end of the trial asked if he had anything to say for himself, and he said, "Yes, I lost a very good chair." A year later, he was elected to the United States Senate. So that's a visceral way of helping people sort of connect to these stories. This panel in the center is taken from a historically Black college. We're not exactly sure which, but it was from an exhibit that was done on Black art collections held within Black colleges. And this is Sojourner Truth, painted by the noted Black artist Charles White. And this piece was donated to us, believe it or not, by a new and dear friend who bought it on eBay and thought it was 36 inches long. And when she got it, found that it was much longer and had no place for it in her home, and so donated it to us. This is just sort of a long shot where you can see what I consider sort of the importance of the integration of both the mercantile and the historic stories that we're trying to tell. We have found that people really find it engaging and interesting to interact with things that they can buy while side by side being told stories. For example, in a later photo, you'll see several Black authors in Rhode Island, which we have posited next to books that are for sale about African Americans. So this is a little smaller exhibit of Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, the first Black woman to graduate from RISD. often thought to be the first person of color to graduate from RISD. She's actually preceded by almost 10 years by an African-American man, Mr. Thomas, who becomes a jewelry designer, very successful here in Providence. And in the corner, you see Edward Mitchell Bannister, founder. We believe it was his concept that made the Providence Art Club an idea that then was brought to fruition by many of his friends. In this display case are more objects dedicated to the Bannisters. Where you see that little loop of blue ribbon is actually a book that was owned by Bannister and bears his signature. Finding such items are incredibly difficult today. Hard to see, but in the center of this image is a portrait of Rebecca Howard, age 13, and in the painting looking much older. She was painted by Charles Stetson, a white artist and the closest friend that Bannister had at the art club. And fascinatingly enough, we found in a published diary of Stetson the actual account of painting this portrait. And he very kindly on the back indicates who she is, the date that it's painted. She was born, we know, on Thayer Street. She disappears after her birth record, so we're not quite sure where she ended up. And he talks about her timidity of putting on a purple dress that he wanted her to wear for the painting. And when you learn that she's 13 in the presence, the sole presence of a white man, you can understand her resistance. It's a beautiful portrait, and it's a really important association to Bannister. This, we believe, is the first letter that connects John Brown of the John Brown House to enslaving Africans, in which he writes about, to a friend of his, whether he should start engaging, and he's heard about a young African female, and is this a good enterprise? So an incredibly rare document with a transcription. This is the famous McGee Street sign, which the city, when it took down, gave us. We believe that this is the beginning, certainly in Rhode Island, of the removal of anti-Black monuments. 5 panels that give you snapshots. These are particularly valuable for children or for people who don't want to read a lot of text. That give you a sense of the beginning of slavery in Rhode Island, the use of rum to purchase enslaved people, the brave Black regiment in the Revolutionary War, the beginning, the first, I was kind of annoyed, shall I say, I don't know how many of you have watched Dr. Gates, who's actually a very good friend of Ray, his new series, Making Black America, in which he talks about the Prince Hall Masons being the first sort of formal organization created by African Americans. And that's not true, because in 1780 in Newport, the African Union Society is created, which is created essentially to help particularly low-income African Americans help bury their dead. But it becomes the first African American philanthropical organization in America. And then the last panel is a look at what was called Negro cloth, which is another way that white people implicate Africans and African Americans in the slave trade, because what happens is enslaved people in the South pick cotton, it's shipped to the North. In the mills that are created by the Browns and others that begin the Industrial Revolution are woven into what's called Negro cloth, returned to the South and turned into clothing that enslaved people wear. And so that cycle is as interesting as the triangle trade, because it is a cyclical and sick cycle. This is a model of a dress that Ciceretta Jones would have worn to perform in, and it's worn by one of our reenactors in many of the events that we present publicly. This is the series of portraits that I mentioned of Black authors in Rhode Island. Many of us don't know that we have a Harlem Renaissance author within our midst, and probably one of the finest writers during the Harlem Renaissance, Rudolph Fisher, who you'll see on your upper right, went to classical high school. We found his yearbooks with his involvement in so many aspects of his education, and graduated from Brown University at the top of his class, became one of the first doctors to engage with X-ray technology, and sadly lost his life to exposure. So he had a short life, dying in his 30s, but not before creating what is known today as the Black mystery novel or detective novel. This is a look at runaway slave ads. Many people think that the runaway concept was just a Southern thing, and that placing ads to retrieve them, again, was simply happening in the South. This happened all over Rhode Island. The ads are disturbing and fascinating because they are essentially written portraits of those who escaped, with complexion, scars, texture of hair, and what they were wearing at the time that they escaped. And so in conclusion, we just opened 2 weeks ago at the Aldrich House at the Rhode Island Historical Society, our newest exhibit, which is on display here tonight. I hope you have a chance to look at it either as you came in or before you leave, which is really the first time that the African American press in Rhode Island has been examined. And we believe examined in a pretty significant and deep way, with wonderful stories that not only look at the newspapers themselves, but the editors, the publishers, the newspaper boy or girl who delivered those papers, the agents who helped market those papers to the Black community. It was a very, very different process than a white newspaper, because Black people didn't have a lot of money, and in many cases, not a lot of information on what the newspapers were or how to access them. And so we discovered the Frederick Douglass African American News Agency, founded here in Providence, which marketed not only local papers, but national papers to the Black community. Fascinating stories on women's involvement in the press. One of my favorite stories being Maricha Lyons in the bottom section of the middle panel, the first Black child to graduate from an integrated school in Providence. The minute she graduates in 1869, moves to New York, becomes a teacher and an elocutionist, meets Ida B. Wells, the foremost champion of ending lynching of Black men, who has fled from Memphis, Tennessee, after her offices were attacked by a white mob, comes to New York for safety, meets Maricha Lyons, who sees the extraordinary potential of this young woman and teaches her how to speak publicly about her mission, and gathers together at that time the largest assemblage of Black women in New York City for Ida B. Wells to be essentially launched into society and to talk about her purpose as an editor and newspaper woman. And lastly, in the final panel, we're really excited to bring to light James N. Ray, the largest photo in the middle section on the right of that panel, the first Black journalist at the Providence Journal, hired in 1950. Some people say, what took you so long? Others say it's probably about the right time that most newspapers were hiring Black writers. He stays for 33 years, and they were not pleasant years. No one who is still alive who knew him can remember anything about him, which is an indication that they didn't interact with him. And he would tell you, as he did Ray, and a fortunate interview that Ray had with him near the end of his career at the Journal, that he was not treated well, and in many cases was treated as a gopher. But he won a Pulitzer Prize for, and perhaps the first, for the Providence Journal. So an accomplished writer. We have a young man who just recently graduated from Brown, who's written a biography that we will be publishing shortly. And so that's my long-winded way of introducing you to our museum. You all have a card on your seat. We hope that you will visit us. And I now turn it over to Ray Rickman.
So I'd like to tell people that Rob does 90% of the research on these projects, and it's not easy. He discovered 2 newspapers in Newport that, because, you know, everything seems to come out of Providence, we had to find something, and he did. I never get up, you know, I'm supposed to get up and talk about history or something. I want to talk about life. There is no such thing as Black history at all, ever. So Aesop Hopkins, evil, rotten, nasty man, first admiral. You get to be admiral if you're a pirate, and the brother of Stephen Hopkins, who probably buys you the job from Mr. Washington. And he goes to Africa, and he takes this Black boy with him. Can you imagine that? Takes a Black boy on a slave ship. There is no such thing as Black history. It's all Black, white history recently, including Latinos and the like. So I ask people to remember that, because we live in a society where people like to, you know, make everything separate, and they think there are things that are very white. Seriously, I go to the RISD Museum and there are 300 white people there and me. But Nancy Elizabeth Prophet is also there. So there is no such thing as white history. The white guys, men, come down from Burrillville with the wood to build the ships to go to Africa. Keep that in mind. So all my adult life, I've asked white people who have clout and money and prestige and access to promote Black history. Every chance you get. You run a foundation, instead of once every 5 years giving a little bit of money, give it direct to something Black, because that Black thing is part of the whole society. It really is. You come by Market Square, and I have no proof of this, but the architect of Market Square and the contractor of Market Square both had slaves. Now, you don't think the slaves helped build Market Square? Now, Brown University's edifice, we know because it's in the records, the Browns controlled the building of that city building. They controlled everything they wanted to, and the records aren't clear. But can I tell you what I know? Black people are every place and excluded from advancement. Just think, a newspaper has 110 writers and only 1 Black person forever. And the reason they have them is because every newspaper in America went out and got 1 Black writer, except the New York Times, they got 3. And then they practice racism, but it's not racism because the place is integrated because they have 1 Black writer who they treat poorly. Rhode Island is one of the worst places in America for Black people. Worse. Now, people don't like to hear that because it must be Mississippi. No, it's Rhode Island. You're a slave, and then you're not a slave, and you're cutting wood, and you're a maid in somebody's house for the next 100 years, right into the 1960s. No Black can practice medicine. Rudolph Fisher has to go to New York. 125 Black people get a medical degree, and not a single one of them practice in Rhode Island, because you can't get hospital privileges. So you can't be a doctor where you can't practice in a hospital. Racism. And then it's so bad. The first time I heard this, Morgan, I was just mortified. Black people can't work in a factory. I'm an ex-Detroiter. Black people work in factories. Ford makes them foremans in the 1920s. And after World War II, Ford starts firing white people from the South because they mistreat his Black employees. Mr. Ford says, I run this factory. You from Mississippi, Alabama, you don't run this factory, you work here. And the next time you call a Black person a name or hit him, you're fired. So Black people could work in factories in Detroit. Not here. The factories for Italians or for French Canadians or for Irish only. You're Swedish, you can't get a job. You want to talk about racism. Our next door neighbor, Virginia Williams, was the first Black banker in Rhode Island. The banking people came to, we all know him, I won't mention his name, he's a nice man. And they said, you know, you're going to be put on the list as a racist institution because the Civil Rights Acts are passing next week and you have no Black employees. So he went to the flower shop and he said to Virginia Williams, would you like to be a banker? And she said, no. And he says, I know what you make, I'll double your pay. She said, no. And he comes back the next day and he offered her 20% more, and Virginia Williams becomes a banker in 1967. No Black ever worked in a bank in Rhode Island. First time in Rhode Island, I went into one of the big law firms, 100 white lawyers, not a single Black person. And then they get one. You probably, half of you know who I'm talking about. They get one. And then they fire him over a nothing. He goes to Boston and probably makes $2 million a year. Are you listening? And then when they fire him, they take 4 years to get a replacement, another Black person, because all the Black people have to be number 1, 2, 3 at Harvard. The white people can be number 27 at Yale. Did I say Harvard's better than Yale? So are you listening to me? Because every place I go, I try to get people to right the wrong, to make the past old and to start anew. And every place they're at, to ask for a progressive plan be put in place. And if you're short on cash, 1% of all our cash will be spent with people of color. If you've got a lot of cash, 10%. Whether you're a foundation, whether you're an institution, whether you're a private school, and you see schools trying. You see all the private schools trying for the last 20 years. But I'm not sure of anything, because every time I look up, the diversity officer has been fired again. So let me say this, and then I'm going to tell you a story. All of us can do better. All of us. And again, you know, I'm my mother's son and I'm supposed to be sweet. But in Rhode Island, almost every institution I look at has a racist basis for its existence. And not in 1880 or whatever, but yesterday, or even still today. And people see it and do nothing about it. Now, the other thing that happens, and this is our charge. Every time I talk to a Black kid, he's never been to the RISD Museum. Never. Never been in the Athenaeum. Never. Now, we do our share. We take them to the Lippitt House. We take them to the University Club, you know, once a year. We do it. But I'm waiting for the world to begin, for all of these institutions to have a serious outreach and not a phony outreach. Almost everybody I can mention to you, and there are exceptions. Brown has done an enormously wonderful job of integrating its student body. Enormous, but not most other institutions in this state. So the world could begin tomorrow. If you run a foundation, on December 1, sit down and say, what percentage of our money have we given to Black and Brown and Indigenous people? And when you find out you haven't, because what happens is they give some money to AS 220, excuse me for mentioning names, so that they can help somebody Black or Brown. And those programs, and I love AS 220, but those programs are never thorough. They're never connected. They're never involving Black women. They're never, never, never. They're so fragile. And when you look up, they're gone. And if they'd given the money straight to South Providence, whatever, it would be better used. Now, change the subject. So I used to be Deputy Secretary of State, best job I ever had in my life, I think, except I was Chief of Staff to U.S. Congressman John Conyers. Best job I ever had in my life. And now I'm Executive Director of Stages for Freedom. Best job I ever had in my life. I don't think I ever had a bad job. But anyway, so I go to the British Library and I show up, and you have to show your ID. And you show the ID and it says I'm Deputy Secretary of State, and they send the young man running and they bring this researcher, 2 PhDs, to help the Deputy Secretary of the United States of America. And I kind of realized that they've made a mistake, but what does it mean? And they assign me this person. And they say, anytime you're here, and I go every year for 3 years, and he comes out, Mr. Rickman. And I have a card that says I'm Deputy Secretary of State of the United States of America. And I never correct them. I think it's one of the few lies I've told. I didn't tell it. I never told them that. So one of the many things that happens when you have your own researcher who has 2 PhDs, and I go there every day when I go to London. Here I am. So I'm after Black material related to Rhode Island, and they find a short history of the African-American meeting and schoolhouse erected in Providence, Rhode Island in the years 1819, 20, 21, with the rules for its future government, published by particular request, meaning Moses Brown wrote this, and he didn't put his name on it. And it is the most fascinating document you can read on Black life at that time. And he wrote it in 1819, and he wrote it to take it to Philadelphia and raise money because the Quakers here were stingy. They're building a Black church and then something extraordinary, a Black school. And the Black people come up with half the money, and Moses gives the piece of land and says he'll raise the other half. Now, I want you to know 3/4 of these folks are barely out of slavery and have no money. Can I tell you, this is like getting money from a 7-year-old kid. It is very hard to do. So this is a 32-page pamphlet in which Moses talks about why Black people should have their own church. And he says white folks are racist. They're awful human beings who put their foot on Black people's necks and backs every chance they get. And they're unforgiving. They subjected them to slavery and they blame them for it. And the first thing they do is talk about African chiefs being the reason for slavery. And white people had nothing to do with it. They had no boats. They had nothing to do with slavery. And Moses talks about all of this stuff. Now, it's intriguing because Moses got to be a very rich man on Negro cloth and Slater Mill and doing abolitionist manumission papers. And so Moses is a complex man. I wish I knew more. There are 2 bad books on him. One of them, I think Moses Brown had it written about 60 years ago, and it's a really bad book. And someone should do something serious on Moses to see what made him click. But this is one of the most fascinating books ever written because prominent white folks don't call the whole white community racist. They don't do it. Now, what happens? They put the money together. All of these progressive Quakers in Philadelphia cough up half the money, and they build on Meeting Street the African-American Meeting House, 600 seats. That's a pretty big church. And the wall on one side has 12-foot high windows. And guess what that's for? It's for a school. It's 1821. Do you know there are no public schools in Providence? There are no public schools until 1826. And where do the public schools come from? white folks have a fit that Black people have a school and they don't have one. And they go to the legislature and they yell and scream and holler, and the legislature says, we don't have any money. And then finally, the legislature orders all the towns and cities to pay for public schools. You with me? So Black folks got public schools for the white folks by having one of their own. It's an extraordinary piece of history. But it's not Black history. It's white history, Black history, Quaker history. I wish someone had painted the building. I'd love to see it. I'm going to tell you one other thing. In 17, I went to 17 libraries and talked about slavery. And in 18, I went to 18 libraries and talked about racism. And each time I asked the 40, 50, 60 people in Little Compton, 180 people came to hear me talk. And I asked them if they will do something. In the 90 days between now and whatever, if you will do something. Now, what could something be? Buying 100 Toni Morrison books on race and giving them to your friends. You ain't got $100, buy 10. Do something. You want to pay for a swimming lesson for a Black kid? $100. Do something. And I know my sister, who's a shrink, says the better you are, the less you have to do. I'm not a racist, so you never do anything except say, I'm not a racist. There are 100 ways to turn the world upside down, and it's not all money. I've done 400, maybe more, 500 workshops on race and diversity for fire and police all over New England and Michigan. And the first question I asked the 40 people in the room is, have you ever had a serious conversation on race with a person of an opposite race? 50 people in the room, one hand goes up, and that's the chief of police who went to a seminar. Are you with me? We're not dialoguing, we're not talking, we're not elevating Black people, we're not elevating Latinos. And even when you think, and this is the last thing I'm going to say without names, even when you think somebody new is in charge, they're not. They don't control the systems. A mayor of Providence can fix the potholes and maybe the schools. And I'm in a state of prayer for Brett Smiley. State of prayer, because there are 24,000 children in the school system being abused daily. $600 million spent on. It's a crime. But we have 3,000 or 4,000 institutions that the mayor of Providence does not control. You do. And every place you are, you could make a little difference, a little. Now I'm going to stop because I could go on all night. And I hope you heard what I said about there being no Black history. It's your history. I want to thank the sponsors for today. It is good to be pushed up. And then finally, I want to thank Rob. If you see the research he does, this history will be lost forever without him. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Morgan Greff, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society, and it is my distinct pleasure to sit in for Matt Barisi tonight, but also to sit here with my friends, Ray and Rob, who I have the pleasure of working with fairly frequently, I would say.
Okay.
And also to talk about the project that I'm proud to be a part of, hoping to make it real. And so I have some questions tonight. We have a few minutes left with the live audience and the audience at home. And I wanted to start with a question for you, Ray, in terms of this question of what we can all do. If you run a foundation, if you run a school, are there, I'm sure there are, but do you have a city, a place, a foundation that people can look to and say, they're doing it well?
Ford. But let me give you the best example in the entire world, and no one's noticing. The publisher of the New York Times, Brown grad, just got to be publisher probably 4 years ago, recently. And it was a fight between him and the first cousin, and he won. And he goes out to the Bronx on a Sunday to a festival with 5,000 people. And he goes up to the coordinator, and she says, "I don't like you, you're a racist." And he says, "No, you're confused. My name is Schultzberger, and I'm a liberal Jewish person. How dare you?" And she says, "No, you're a racist. 20 times we've asked for coverage in your paper, and we never get it." And he comes in on the Monday, all the arts and cultural people were there. And he says, "Why do we not cover that festival? It was fabulous." And they said, "Well, they don't have the right PR people. They don't send us the right whatever." She sends us a 2-page release, and it's not that good. And he says the city's 51% Black and brown. And this paper is going to reflect it. You look in the New York Times today, 51% Black and brown in the cultural arena. It is 4 and 5 days a week. It is the only example I've ever seen of that, ever. Because everybody else wants to do something for Black History Month for one day, one event, and that's it. The New York Times hired new people because he said the old people, they mistreated that woman for 20 years. And that is a long answer. But I tell people, anytime I get ready to do something, and it has to do with Italians, I call my 5 Italian friends and say, "Do I know what I'm doing?" And they say, "No." You have to do that. So that's my answer to you. The Times, if you look at it, it will take your breath away. And nobody else. The Providence Journal, the opposite. And forget it being a declining paper. It's the opposite. That's a long answer, but I gave you extraordinary. We can do lesser. We really can, because when we get, our third day of the pandemic, God thought that we did something wrong and ripped our roof off our house. And we hired an Asian man to fix it. You can do that. You really can.
Thank you. So when we think about, obviously,
I'm sorry for the long answer.
Oh, no, not at all. It's your show. So when we think about what we can all do, one of the things that you do, obviously, is you do this incredibly deep research, which was mentioned during your remarks and during Ray's, how challenging it is to find, despite the fact that there are 1,000 books by and about people of African heritage in Rhode Island. There's still so much primary research and still so many things that are incomplete in this understanding and in this bibliography and lexicon of our work. What is it, what are you looking for right now? You found those newspapers in Newport. What are you digging for right now?
Well, it's interesting because when I started Disappearing Ink, the bibliography that I published, I went to all the leading scholars in the state asking for their input. And their answer was, "Good luck, there's not much there." And, I've proved them wrong. The search always reveals the search. I don't always know. I mean, one of the most exciting finds in this exhibit on the Black press in Rhode Island was essentially by, I won't say mistake, but I wasn't looking for Alexander Niger, the first Black printer in Rhode Island, who at least as early as 1850 is printing white newspapers. It's the first African-American to be accepted into a typographical union in the country. But I found him, and I knew that his story had to be included And I also discovered that his house still stands on the east side. So it's always finding what I call historical breadcrumbs that lead to the next story. So the work that I've done here will reveal itself as some other project down the road. And I don't know what that is yet. I do know that the next grant that we've received that will manifest itself in a similar sort of series of panels is going to look at African-American gay men in Rhode Island. And that's been funded by the Equity Coalition at the Rhode Island Foundation. So I'm excited to help tell that story, which has been told in a smaller way in those exhibits that we did at the John Hay Library.
Yeah. So Morgan, Frederick Douglass was here at least in Providence 7 or 8 times. And he spoke at Congdon, and he stayed in George Benson's house on Prospect, and blah, blah, blah. And William Lloyd Garrison and gang came to this museum, came to the Athenaeum and hung out on 2 different days when he was with them. And if he was here, well, he didn't sign the book if he was here. So I have 500 of those research projects. And I always wish, why doesn't someone do them? Because we can only do so much. And I think the Athenaeum, it would be so fabulous if they could say, and this is a mild criticism, but William Lloyd Garrison hung out here. And the average person doesn't know that. I think Douglass hung out here. So I'm a signage man. I really am. I would like to see a plaque saying, and by the way, there are 10 incredible women who hung out here too. And so there are all these projects and people are waiting for someone else to do them. And I think they should stop and say, I'm retired or I'm this, and I'm going to go do this little project.
But you know, the Frederick Douglass story is exceptional. And it sort of goes to the point that when we went to the Culinary Arts Museum at J&W in 2011 and said, we want to do this exhibit, we didn't know what we were going to unveil, but we knew enough that wasn't embodied in their exhibit that could be told. And so it's always my position that if you start with a really good idea, then it will reveal many more good ideas. And so when we looked at Frederick Douglass and we did our project, which actually was held here as a virtual event in 2020 with Dr. David Blight, the foremost scholar who wrote Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, the best biography ever written by Douglass, and soon to be a major motion picture. We actually inspired him because he said, I had no idea the enormity of Frederick Douglass's footprint. Frederick Douglass learns to become an orator, the greatest orator at that time, the most photographed human being, more than Lincoln, at that time, by going from these small little towns during the Dorr Rebellion, pleading the case for Black suffrage. He learns to be a stump speaker. So I created this wonderful video that was presented before Dr. Blight's talk on the impact that Frederick Douglass had in Rhode Island. I have a timeline, I haven't published that yet, of all the sites that he visited in Rhode Island, which are these little nooks and crannies in the state. And then ending with the iconography that's created here in Rhode Island. We have a spoon that's created by 2 Black men, Purdy and Peters, during the spoon, what's called the spoon mania craze, where people collected anything with some kind of iconography on it, in the bowl and the handle, on the ladder, and they create the Frederick Douglass spoon. And believe it or not, when we did that exhibit on the culinary arts history in Rhode Island, we found a man who had just purchased one of those spoons. Incredibly hard to find, and it was included in the exhibit. So Frederick Douglass, again, when we started the project, knew he was important, but not as important as he turned out to be.
Before we started the program tonight, I overheard a conversation, forgive me, eavesdropping, when I think it was Robin or Jenny who commented that one of the things that they love so much about the work that you do and the panels, but also the talks and plaques, is that they are so frequently connecting people living, working in Rhode Island who they may not have heard of and who people outside of this area may not have heard of, but making those connections to these national figures who they have heard of. So it gives them a kind of a context as well.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to say, one, thank you for that. But also, are there other stories that we haven't heard yet of that kind of connection? We've heard the wonderful connections with Ida B. Wells, with Frederick Douglass. What are those stories, again, that help people also understand Rhode Island's place in America at that moment?
So Lovecraft is our person. And he's our person because tourism elevated him. And if I had anything to do with it, they wouldn't have done it. And they did it successfully with Eastern Europeans showing up in droves, and Lovecraft has caught fire. Now we have Rudolph Fisher. I can name you five, wait, forget Black folks. We have 5 or 6 folks who could be elevated. And we don't have anybody to do it because we don't have anybody to do it. I would like to see Rudolph Fisher elevated. I believe he was the very best writer in the Harlem Renaissance. I really do.
That's a big claim.
Mr. Hughes, I'm sorry. Hughes is prolific and he does 10 things. Fisher only creates the Black detective novel and it reads like butter melting on bread, and he needs to be elevated. So we need to name a street after him. We need to put a plaque up, and then we need to put a statue up, and then we need to have an annual conference, and we'll get around to it. But right now we have 3 years of Edward Bannister coming.
We do indeed.
And the goal is at the end of that time, 25% of Rhode Islanders will say, I know Edward Bannister. And next June, whatever, someone related to you, husband, is the sculptor on the Edward Bannister statue. And we're going to put up a plaque for Christiana Cato Bannister a month before or after and elevate these incredible people. Now, final comment on this. My goal is to get 100 people to donate for the big plaque. It's easier to go to 1, 2, 3 people, go to foundation. I don't want that. I want 100 people to take ownership, walk by and say, I gave 100, tell their 2 grandchildren, I gave $100 to that. People brag when they give you money. And adopt her. Just adopt her. In the State House, I was chair of a commission to get Christiana Cato's bust. And it is one of the most stunning pieces of art you will ever see. But there's a problem. Mr. Bannister on the street that Gage is doing will be seen by close to 1 million people a year. Mrs. Bannister seen by 2,000 because they're all running at the State House and they never stop paying attention to anything. So she needs to come out on the street, and we're going to do that. All I say to people all the time is you have this power, use it. I don't know.
One of the things that is so central to Stages of Freedom, to all of the work you've done, is youth empowerment, whether it's swim empowerment, whether it's bringing students in and reaching them. And I wonder when you were coming up, what was the museum? What was the library? What was the place that moved you?
Can I go first?
Oh, sure.
I grew up in the best city in America. The Fords, the Chryslers, the Strohs, these were not like the people here. I went to Ford Auditorium 4 times a year to see modern dance, to see everything you can imagine. We went to the Philharmonic 4 times a year. We went to everything paid for by those 10 automotive, the Buells. And then later in life, I met some of them. And I met Eleanor Ford. And I went up to Mrs. Ford and I said, I love you. She said, oh, I hear that all the time. They paid for millions of kids to be acculturated. There's none of that here, none. Again, excuse my honesty, I've passed 70. The RISD Museum until the last 20 years was a closed door to anybody. You could get in there. I don't want anybody to say that I said you couldn't, but Mrs. Ford did not exist here. So I grew up in an unbelievable place, and the school system may have been the best in the nation. Now, let me tell you, Ray Rickman tries not to lie. Are you ready? 76 home ownership in Detroit amongst Black folks as late as 1970 before the city collapsed. That same year, 7% home ownership amongst Black folks in Rhode Island. You with me? This is a backward, stingy, racist place that takes its cultural institutions, wraps their arms around them, and don't let people in. And it costs nothing to troop 100 Black, Latino, Asian, Native kids through that museum every other Saturday. Well, I'm sorry, it might cost something. But that's the difference between Detroit and here. Now, by the way, Detroit has now collapsed, but it was the most open place. I met, name me, and I'm going to be quiet. I met, name me somebody. They came to Detroit Institute of Arts. It was unbelievable. You went to meet, and there'd be 3,000 of us sometimes, and you'd be taken on buses paid for by the Chryslers. Final comment, because I'm always supposed to talk about swimming. Black kids, only 80% of Black people do not swim. Black kids drown 5.5 times, and the government and the social elements have done nothing to fix that. In Detroit, there were 9 high schools and 16 swimming pools. I went to a school with a girls' swimming pool, a boys' swimming pool, and then a little pool. And one was done by the city and one was done by the Strohs. And I don't know who did the little one. In Providence, no high school has a swimming pool. You just gasp at something that backwards. And then there's no effort to fix it yet.
Well,
That's a long answer, but I get very excited because I see the possibilities. The wealth is here. It is not expended. And now, and I'm just running off at the mouth, now people, they have their $50 million and they have 3 children. So they can't donate like they used to because they've got to save 15 million for each kid. And you say, okay, save 7 million for each kid and make the world new. Seriously.
well,
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm getting the high sign from the back of the room though. So if you'll forgive me, I am told that every program, the Athenaeum, we ask the same final question.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with Rob.
Okay.
And so that question is, what are you currently reading?
Oh, wow.
Well, you kind of previewed this question.
I don't know what you're
Did
talking
you?
about, Rob.
Not with me, she didn't.
And interestingly enough, what I end up reading are these panels.
So
And
you're reading you, is what you're saying.
it's fascinating to create something that stands before the public eye. And I want to make sure that every time it's seen, that it reads the way that it should. And I guess after, 6 months of working on this project and at least a month of tweaking it all and making sure the text is right and the images are juxtaposed properly, that when I go back to it, it still works. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, I do.
And that it has flow and it has meaning and has those connections that Robin so brilliantly put, which is, how each person connects to a thread that is attached to another person. And that's so true. So that's what I'm reading.
Wonderful.
That's what I'm reading.
Thank you. Ray.
So for 30 years, for a whole year, I would pick somebody, Gertrude Stein, the Nation of India, something. And 90% of my reading was that. And I did 3 feminist years because I'm trying. About a year ago, I gave that up, concentrating deeply. So now I read Kafka all the time. I read Baldwin all the time. I'm reading Toni Morrison. I have 10 books. And the other day I came to the Athenaeum and I got 2 Jane Jacobs books who I haven't read in 20 years. She is the best urban thinker in history. And she has about 5 books. People only read one of them. And you read those books and you say, this is unbelievable that this woman could think like this about all of these things that affect urban life. Jane Jacobs.
So we hear it whispered through the room. Jane Jacobs. What am I? I am reading The Woman in the, it's called this Woman in the Silk Gown and the Portrait. And it is an examination of a wealthy woman in early 18th century Philadelphia who is painted by Feek, and the dress she is wearing, and it goes in deeply to where the fabric is made, who designs it, who manufactures it, how the paint is made, how the canvas is made, who's doing the work of making this painting actually happen. And so that's what I'm reading right now. Thank you for asking. And before we turn over, I have to say that this is all the time that we have with our audience at home. And so I want to thank them for joining us. I want to thank Ray and Rob, not just for tonight, but for absolutely everything that you do for this community, for the state, for us. And I want to, again, thank you here in the reading room and everyone at home, and wish you a wonderful evening. So thank you, take care, and I wish you well.